In a matter of weeks, China went from a zero-tolerance policy to COVID-19 to dismantling the majority of its preventative efforts. While many people embrace these long-awaited changes, they also present new difficulties and risks to businesses and the economy. Governments around the world have imposed or are considering restrictions on Chinese travelers as corona cases in the country have increased following the country's easing of zero-COVID policies. Countries have expressed concern about a wave of infections due to a lack of information from China on variants. In light of the absence of information, the World Health Organization has called the precautionary steps understandable and urged Beijing to release more data on genetic sequencing and details on hospitalizations, deaths, and immunizations. But who are these countries, and why are measures being taken? In response to mounting cases, France, Germany, Greece, Italy, Spain, and Sweden have tightened restrictions on Chinese visitors, while the EU has yet to reach an agreement on a coordinated strategy for the evolving COVID-19 situation. The bloc has strongly advocated a negative test requirement. Other ways could involve new variant monitoring, surveillance and sequencing, testing and vaccine regulations, and hygiene and health measures for flying passengers. According to the Italian health minister, Italy was the first EU country to tighten restrictions, mandating COVID-19 antigen swabs and viral sequencing for all Chinese visitors. Similarly, Spain is the second European country to impose COVID restrictions on Chinese visitors, who must now submit a negative test result or proof of immunization. After previously claiming that increased border restrictions were unnecessary, France has declared that starting on January 5th, all travelers arriving from China will be required to have a negative PCR or antigen test taken less than 48 hours before boarding. Sweden has also stated that it will require negative tests for visitors arriving from China. The Belgian mayor has also called for COVID checks on Chinese tourists entering the country. As part of an additional measure to combat the spread of the coronavirus, the government stated on Monday that it would test wastewater from flights coming from China for new COVID variants. Moreover, the UK has reversed its initial assertion that it has no plans to reinstate COVID-19 testing for Chinese visitors. The Department of Health announced on Friday that a pre-departure negative COVID-19 test would be required as of January 5th. Also, Australia, Canada, India, Israel, Malaysia, Morocco, Qatar, South Korea, Taiwan, and the United States have all implemented additional COVID procedures for Chinese immigration. After initially stating that it will not restart testing, Australia has declared that beginning on January 5th, travelers arriving from China will now be required to show a negative COVID-19 test taken within 48 hours of departure. According to Ottawa, air travelers from China must test negative for COVID-19 no more than 2 days before departure. For visitors arriving from China, Hong Kong, Japan, South Korea, Singapore, or Thailand, a COVID-19 negative test report is required. Passengers from those countries who exhibit symptoms or test positive will be quarantined. According to health ministry sources, India discovered 11 new COVID-19 variations in international visitors who came to the country between December 24th and January 3rd. 124 of the 19,227 passengers tested positive for COVID-19 during this time period. According to the Times of Israel, Israel's newly appointed health minister, Aryeh Deri, has proposed new COVID-19 testing requirements for Chinese travelers. Malaysia has increased its tracking and surveillance procedures. It will examine all inbound travelers for fever and analyze COVID-19 infected wastewater from aircraft arriving from China. From January 3rd, Morocco will put a ban on all nationalities arriving from China. Qatar will also require travelers traveling from China to provide a negative COVID-19 test result obtained within 48 hours of departure, beginning on January 3rd, according to the state news agency QNA. Meanwhile, Japan said it would also need a negative COVID-19 test upon arrival for Chinese visitors, with those who test positive subjected to a week in quarantine. Tokyo also intends to limit the number of flights to China. Similarly, On-arrival PCR tests for Chinese visitors have been implemented in South Korea. Beginning on January 5th, the country will also demand a negative test result within 48 hours or a fast antigen test within 24 hours of departure. Short-term visas for Chinese nationals are also being restricted. On-arrival PCR testing for all passengers on direct flights from China to Taiwan and by boat at 2 offshore islands has been implemented. The Philippines is likewise considering mandating tests and has increased surveillance on symptomatic Chinese passengers. Except for airline wastewater testing for the virus by Malaysia and Thailand, the rest of Southeast Asia will treat Chinese visitors the same as any other. U.S. officials are also tightening controls, citing a lack of transparent data from Beijing. Beginning on January 5th, all flight passengers aged 2 and up will be required to have a negative test result no more than 2 days before departure from China, Hong Kong, or Macau. Meanwhile, China is criticizing the countries that impose discriminatory COVID restrictions on tourists departing from China, calling it political manipulation. We do not believe the entry restriction measures some countries have taken against China are science-based, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Mao Ning said Tuesday at a regular press briefing in Beijing. Some of these measures are disproportionate and simply unacceptable. We firmly reject using COVID measures for political purposes and will take corresponding measures in response to varying situations via the principle of reciprocity. As mentioned above, the inbound travelers to China will be required to demonstrate simply a negative PCR test, obtained within 48 hours of departure beginning Sunday, January 8th. This represents a dramatic modification of China's zero-COVID policy. Foreign visitors have been effectively forbidden from entering China since 2020, with occasional exceptions for business or family visits. However, an increasing number of nations are reluctant to welcome Chinese visitors, citing the high occurrence of COVID infections in China and a lack of information on variations as reasons for concern. Beginning January 5th, the United States will also require COVID-19 tests for Chinese tourists. Just 3 days before China's announcement, the U.S. State Department updated its Level 3 travel recommendation, urging Americans to reconsider visiting China, Hong Kong, and Macau due to an increase in COVID-19 cases, arbitrary enforcement of local laws, and COVID-19 related restrictions. Economically, splurge-prone Chinese tourists are highly valued because they outspend visitors from other countries by a considerable percentage. According to figures from the United States Travel Association, China's 3 million visitors spent more than $36 billion in pre-pandemic 2018. In comparison, China's 21.2 million visitors spent $22.1 billion in the United States that year. We look forward to welcoming Chinese travelers back to the United States. The Biden administration's highly targeted COVID testing approach is reasonable and appreciated, said U.S. Travel Association President and CEO Jeff Freeman in a statement. Meanwhile, the country's leader, Xi Jinping, declared in a New Year's address that China stands on the right side of history, as doubts swirl over his government's handling of COVID-19 and domestic and international economic and political issues. Speaking on national television from behind a desk in a wood-paneled office, Xi avoided directly addressing the country's problems, instead emphasizing triumphs in agricultural production, poverty eradication, and the country's hosting of the Winter Olympics in February. However, he later shifted his focus to the world's most populous country and second largest economy, declaring, "The world is not at peace." China would always steadfastly advocate for peace and development and stands unswervingly on the right side of history, he said. In recent months, there have been major protests against Xi's leadership, the first such demonstrations against the ruling Communist Party in more than 3 decades. The Chinese economy is struggling to recover, causing increased unemployment, while relations with the United States and other major countries are at historic lows. People in Beijing and other cities have returned to work, shopping malls, and restaurants, with consumers preparing for the Lunar New Year holiday, the most important in the Chinese calendar in January. Xi, who also commands the country's growing military might, was elected to a third 5-year term as chairman of the Communist Party in October. He may theoretically continue as China's leader for the rest of his life, having sidelined potential opponents and eliminating any term limitations. China has also come under fire for its continued backing of Russia, and Xi conducted a virtual meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin on Friday, during which he was described as calling the situation in Ukraine a crisis. The phrasing was a break from China's normal references to the Ukraine situation, and it may suggest growing Chinese anxiety about the conflict's course. Xi was careful to reaffirm China's support for Moscow in his speech to Putin. China has pledged a no-limits friendship with Russia and has not blamed Putin for the war, while criticizing the United States and NATO and condemning harsh economic penalties placed on Russia.